Welcome to the Night Club, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. I have a lot of people watching my videos that are actually like garage welders, people that do a lot of DIY, and I've actually been getting a lot of questions about welding sheet metal, particularly body panels. So as we know, body panels are fairly thin sheet metal. The pieces of metal that I have here are actually for a parts truck that I have, so I went ahead and chopped up a couple pieces from there, and then I went ahead and cleaned the edges. The sheet metal that we're working with today is 045, or I guess 19 gauge, so it's fairly thin stuff. Usually on the newer cars you have something closer to like 20 gauge or 22 gauge, but this is as thin as I was able to find, so that's what we're going to be using today. What you guys got to remember when welding sheet metal is that because it's so thin, you really can't put a lot of heat into this kind of material. You're going to end up warping it, you're going to end up blowing holes through it, and that's what a lot of people seem to struggle with. So the number one thing you actually got to do is you got to go through and clean the edges of whatever you're going to weld. You always want to weld on clean metal, but the main reason you want to do that is because you want to light up the weld as easily as possible. The faster you can get your weld flowing, the less heat you're going to put into the material. And when we're welding thin metal, we're not necessarily looking for penetration. We actually are just looking to make the metal stick, because the penetration will come on its own. So I've got this two pieces right here that used to be one big piece, and I've actually cut that in half. That way I can get the gaps as close as possible, because I know they used to belong to each other. So that's going to be tip number 2 for you guys, is actually keep your gaps as close as possible. If you have gaps kind of like this, it's going to be a lot harder for you to bridge it, because you're going to be spending a lot of time on the welder trying to get the gaps closed up. So if you can close in that gap as much as possible, you're going to have a much greater chance of success, and the chance of you actually warping it is going to be a lot smaller. So I don't really have a welding table, but I have this piece of flat stock that I have here. I've cleaned up a little bit of the edges that's going to be touching the flat stock, and I've also cleaned up the grounding point down at the end, so that way I have a nice clean ground for me to work on. If your ground is dirty, you're going to require more heat to actually get your weld across, and we're going to have the same problems that I talked about earlier. Before you actually start welding across, you're going to want to do two things. The first thing you're going to want to do is spray down everything with anti-spatter spray. That's going to keep your metal nice and clean for when after you're done welding, you're going to be able to clean it right off. And the second thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tack weld these two pieces together, and that's going to allow everything to hold nice and tight as you're going through and welding the rest of it. So you're going to want to turn down the heat settings on your machine as low as you can, and you're going to work them back up if you need more heat or if you need more wire speed. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat and the wire speed on my machine, and then we're going to get some tacks on. I mentioned this on my welding exhaust video, but the best thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start on one piece of material, preferably the flat side, and then you're going to pull it toward the next material, and then you're going to want to pull it back, and that's going to create a solid tack. So we're going to start on one, pull it here, and then going back. You're going to want to do like an O shape, and that's going to basically spin the metal around and create a nice tight weld. You're also going to want to keep the stick out nice and short, so you don't want like a full inch of stick out. You're going to want something closer to about 3/8 of an inch, about 10 millimeters or smaller if you can. I did the first tack, and as you guys can see, the weld actually pulled the metal and opened it from the bottom, so we actually got to tighten this back up and close it. It looks like it's going to be pulling, so I'm going to need to use a clamp to actually close this up. If you don't close up this gap, you're going to be fighting your welder, and the chance of you blowing through go up really high. I don't really have locking pliers, so I'm just going to use this C-clamp. Alright, so I went ahead and tightened up this gap, and now we can go ahead and continue with the tack welds. Every time you guys are planning to do tack welds, between tack welds you're going to want to break off the tip of the wire, because that actually becomes a hard spot and it makes it a little bit harder for you to strike your weld. So you're going to want to break that off, get your stick out as small as you can, break it off, and then get back on it. Now that I've got the second tack weld on there, I'm going to go ahead and remove the clamp. If I go ahead and flip it around, you guys are going to see the penetration was already there regardless of how much time I actually put on there. So now what we're actually going to do is we're going to go ahead and tack weld all the way across. You're going to see that we did get a little bit of warpage. You can't really see it on camera, but if you line these up as straight as you can vertical, you're going to be able to tell that one of the panels is higher or lower than the other one. So the best way to do that is to get clamps, and you go ahead and take the clamps and you push it together, and then that'll line up the panel. For the purpose of this video, I don't really care. So we're going to go through and we're just going to finish welding this panel all the way across. Essentially, we're just going to be doing tack welds all the way down until we finish the end of the panel. So that was the easy way to do it. Let's go ahead and clean up the weld to see what it looks like. So I went ahead and cleaned up the front and the back. So as you guys can see here, I've got weld all the way through. And if I turn this around, you guys can see that I've got full union between both pieces. And in fact, it all looks like one big piece, and you could actually go and put this back on the car and you wouldn't have to worry about it breaking. Although everything is welded pretty solid, the repair itself is not successful, because if you guys can look at here, because of all the heat that went through as I was going across, we actually had a problem with the warpage because we introduced way too much heat into the material. Normally this isn't as big of a problem on thicker metals, but on sheet metal, if you just go ahead and try and weld it all the way across like I did here, you're going to have a similar result. And if you're trying to create some sort of patch panel, you're going to have a really hard time trying to get this to line back up onto the car. Now I'm going to show you guys a different way to actually get this done. So I went ahead and cut it right where the weld was, and now I'm going to go ahead and create a little bit of a curve on these to hopefully straighten the panels back out, so I can demonstrate a different way that you guys could actually get this done. So I went ahead and introduced a little bit of a curve to the metal, and that'll give me something to reference off of so I can check for warpage. Now the first thing you want to do, again, like I mentioned before, is hit this with the anti-spatter spray. You guys will be able to tell that I did not have any spatter stick on the last one that I welded. So I want the same result this time, so we're going to go ahead and spray it down one more time. I'm going to go ahead and hold it, this time with my hand to get the tack welds on, and then we're going to go and show you the other technique. Okay, so I went ahead and I tack welded it back together. This time what I'm going to do, instead of going all the way through, all the way across and getting a weld going, we're going to go ahead and start in the middle, then outside, outside, middle, outside, outside, middle, outside, outside. The same way we're doing the tacks. The only difference is that we're not concentrating the heat in one area, so it's not warping as we're going across. We're giving it a little bit of time to cool in between the welds. That'll give it a couple seconds in between, and hopefully when we get back to it and we go ahead and put in the second tack weld, the heat from the previous weld will dissipate far enough that we're not actually warping the metal. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of this. So that's pretty much done, so let's go ahead and clean this back up. So as you guys can see here, we don't have as much penetration as we did with the previous weld, because we actually would cool down the metal as we're welding, so we don't get as much penetration going all the way across. But one thing we do get to save is actually the warpage from the metal. So the welds don't look nearly as good as the previous one, because every time you're starting and stopping, you're creating another interruption. You're probably going to get a few more voids in your welds, but the overall condition of the sheet metal, and it tends to stay in its correct shape a lot easier, which should be really the goal when you're actually welding sheet metal. Earlier in the video I mentioned that you should really break off the tip of the wire whenever you start a new tack weld, and that's because when you restart your weld, it becomes a lot harder because the tip of the wire actually becomes harder itself, and because of that, it'll take longer for the wire to actually start flowing in the weld. And as you guys can see, this is a perfect example of what happens when you let your wire get dirty or you end up welding with the cold weld. On the other hand, if you don't do it this way, you're going to have a lot of warpage on your panel, so you really have to pick your poison. For sheet metal work, as long as you get a couple good solid tacks, and then you go through and just tack back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, you should have a very strong weld, and you shouldn't have any problems with it coming apart in the near future. The only thing is that it's probably going to require a little bit of cleanup after you're done. So hopefully these tips help you guys when you're welding sheet metal. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.